Before we get started, I would recommend that you go to the video description and grab the GitHub link to this document so we can go through this document together. This is part 2 of the series of deploying Active Directory in the cloud. Now you'll see two different names for this functionality in many places. Microsoft changed the name a couple of years ago, and it hasn't quite got caught on everywhere. It's a bit like the Twitter versus X thing. They want us to use this, but so much of the documentation uses Azure AD Domain Services. So the official name is Azure Intra Domain Services, but you'll see Azure Active Directory Domain Services all over the place. So what we're going to do is do a complete push-button install of how you would install the domain services using Terraform, and then we're going to, do some things with it to demonstrate the features. And so the domain services, I'll just call it Active Directory Domain Services, is a fully managed Active Directory POS solution with Azure, which manages spinning up the domain controllers, managing the patching, the system updates. It takes care of all that for you, and you just get the domain endpoints within the subnet where you create it. So what we're going to do in this solution is do the following tasks. We're going to configure secure networking. There's a subnet for Active Directory. You have to have a separate subnet. There's also a subnet for the VMs that we create and attach to Active Directory. And then we glue up the Azure Active Directory domain instances also act as DNS servers, so you want them in your DNS search path, so we'll update that. So we'll deploy from Terraform AD Domain Services instance. Then we're going to spin up a Linux and Windows server to join them in Active Directory so you can log in using Active Directory domain credentials. When the Windows server starts, it's going to run an AD join script as a VM extension, and in the join script it is going to first join with the domain credentials, which you have to retrieve. And then it's going to proceed and create 4 users and 4 groups using POSIX compliant methods with the UID number, GID number, and store all the credentials. They'll be generated as random credentials, store them in an Azure Key Vault so we can reference them later when we actually want to log in to these instances and kick the tires and see how they work. Now, the Linux server has a boot script that uses SSD to configure that Linux server for authentication with Active Directory. This one is different than the other two examples. We're not using direct Active Directory domain joins with Linux. We're using LDAP, and we'll discuss that a little bit later when we log on to the Linux machine and how it gets built. And then after we do all that, with those 2 instances in Active Directory, we're going to clean up resources, which is particularly important in this example because the generic vanilla Active Directory domain instance costs several $100s a month. So if you're not using it, you probably want to turn it off. You should turn it off. Okay, so let's go to the architecture diagram for what we're going to build. And we're in the central region. We create one virtual network that's AD VNet. And then we have 2 subnets in there. There's actually a third subnet, which is Bastion, which I don't cover that, but that's what we're going to use to actually interact with the instances. So in the first subnet, it's required for Active Directory to be in its own subnet. And so that's where we will deploy Active Directory. It ends up creating 2 domain controllers within that. And once we create that, we'll actually attach these 2 domain controllers to be the DNS servers for this network. So there's a step for that. So once that's done, we then go and we join a Windows instance and a Linux instance. Now the Windows instance, you can't use PowerShip in the custom data script, so we have to use a VM extension, but it acts the same way as a custom data. Essentially, it runs its startup, it retrieves the domain join credentials from the Key Vault, uses it to join, and then adds 4 users and 4 groups into Active Directory as local domain users and pulls them in. Then the second server that boots is Linux. It's going to do the same thing in that it's going to interact with the Key Vault to get the AD join credentials, get in there, configure LDAP to use Linux as an authentication provider, and so that's what we build. And when we demo them, we'll use both of them via Bastion, so we don't have to go through the public internet. So that's it for what we're going to build. Um, what's the prerequisites? Well, we've got several prerequisites. We have a video called Azure and Terraform Easy Setup, which gives a very simple example. It builds a VM. So if you want to sort of a baby step into it, you might want to go that look at that video. What you need is an Azure account, obviously. It has to be pay as you go if you want the Active Directory domain services. You need a AZ CLI. You have to install the latest Terraform, and then you also need Microsoft this provider enabled. And we do that for you in the join script. And then you also need global administrator. I wonder if this is, yeah, global administrator. I updated it recently, but it's now global administrator that you have to have updated. And so the check env script is going to check all that for you. And so I'm assuming you've done all of this to begin with, and now we're ready to download the code and start the build. So we want to take this, and I want to copy this and put it into my Ubuntu development environment. Let me paste that in. And so I've downloaded the code, and now we want to run check env. Ruh-roh, global administrator is not assigned. So what we want to do is assign that. So I'm going to go into my Azure console. I'm going to click on Entra ID, and I'm going to go to roles and administrators, and I'm going to search for global administrator, and you'll see it's not there. My build is in Monaco, so I want to go and say add, and I want to add in Monaco, and that's my build identity. So I add it, hit add, and go back. Now let's go to check env. Okay, now it passes, and we are ready to do the build. Now we'll hit apply, and then we'll walk through, or we'll kind of give an overview of the build, and then we'll let the build finish. So I'm going to do apply, and I'm going to go back to the documentation, and you will see the build, sort of an explanation of the build process. It's really two phases to the build. The first phase is we use Terraform to do the networking and the Active Directory domain services instance. This takes 60 to 90 minutes to deploy. It takes forever. Azure is the longest, absolutely, of the three providers. It takes the longest. So you let that deploy, and then once the directory service is provisioned, the second phase of the build runs custom data scripts to join the instances to the Active Directory. Now Windows looks a little bit differently. You can't actually specify PowerShell in the custom data, so we had to go and do a little work with that. Where we use a VM extension, and then the once that's done, you've got a Windows instance. You've got a Windows instance joined to Active Directory. You've got a Linux instance joined to Active Directory. You have all your credentials in the credential vault or key vault ready to use. So at this point, we let the build finish. Okay, the build has completed. It, like I said, takes anywhere from 60 to 90 minutes to build everything. Most of that is in the Active Directory domain services instance. And so at this point, let's walk through what actually got built. So I'm going to bring up the Azure console, and I'm going to click on resource groups. And in the resource groups, the group that got created was AD resource group. So you click on that, and it's going to give you a list of everything that was built. It's kind of a noisy project because there's a lot of stuff built implicitly, like all these network interfaces or deployed by Terraform when it does the AAD, the domain services instance. So they're indirectly created. Then you've got, let's start with the networking. So if I click on the networking, there are, let's see here, settings, subnets. There are actually three subnets. The two application subnets, the active service domain services subnet, the VMs, and then I include Bastion because when we connect to these instances, I'm going to connect with Bastion and not through the public internet. So that's it for the networking. There's some security groups that are attached that's in the Terraform code. So let's go back to the resource group. And sort of the main event is this Mike Cloud in Microsoft Intra Domain Services instance. And you click on here. And let's go to settings, I guess activity. It should show the builds, synchronization. I guess it's monitoring, I guess. Health. There we go. That's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for the synchronization with Azure AD. So let's talk about that for a minute. What does that mean? Well, again, this is where Microsoft has changed the terminology in places, but in other places. Intra ID is what Azure AD is now called. And so if I go and look at, let me go and bring up another instance here. Open a new tab. And I go to Intra ID. All these users here, these intra Azure Active Directory users, whatever you want to call them, they get synchronized with the Active Directory domain. And so when we talk about how we get the domain join credentials, it's through the synchronization. You actually don't set the accounts directly in the Terraform for admin. You have to create these accounts in your your default tenant, and then they get synchronized over, which presents some challenges when we're trying to script everything. There's some code in places where it's looping, where it's trying once two, because it's has a variable. It's asynchronous, a variable time when you create the user to it actually shows up. Um, and so, in addition to users, there's also groups. And this group is in particular important. We create it in the build if it doesn't exist, and essentially this is a special group. It's done by name that when it synchronizes, any users in this group become domain admins. So if you click in here, you'll see we created the total direct members. It's the mcloud admin. So that's how the users work, and we'll kind of go over it again when we get to the join credentials. So we got that. There's really we took sort of the generic settings for AADS. There's lots of things in here. You can do trusts and replicas, so it's a very full-featured platform as a service offering. And the cloud synchronization of the users is kind of it's kind of neat how they have tried to integrate new users with old users, but you run into problems with things like POSIX compliance and other things that we'll talk about when we get to the users and groups. So that is the cloud instance, or the cloud domain services instance. The next two things are, of course, the Windows VM. So we have a Windows VM that is joined to the domain by a script. We use this for GB. And then we have a Linux instance, which is also joined to the domain using SSD. It's a little bit smaller. You could go with a cheaper instance in there, and they're all attached to the public internet, even though we're going to use Bastion to actually connect. So let me go back to the script here, and I think I've covered. Oh, very important. We create a lot of users, or not users. We create 4 users and 4 groups. Within Active Directory, it's their local users. And so when we do that, we create secrets in a key vault. So if I go and we have this key vault. Now, one thing you'll notice is key vaults are one of those things in Azure which has to be unique across all Azure tenants and clients. So I ended up building a key vault with a random number. That's a little bit different than the other providers as far as how you leverage secrets and stuff. You don't have to have a unique identifier like I do in Azure, but you do have to do that. And then we've got the secrets, and you can see all the accounts that we create, including the admin account. Like here we've got the admin account. I'm going to click on it, and it shows secret value, and it'll show you this is the actual join account that was synchronized from your Azure uh, default tenant. And then if I go back to secrets, there's also each individual user, like Raj Patel. If you go in here, you're going to have it shows secret values, and it'll have his user ID and password. So they're all unique for the build. These are, you can copy and paste all you want. This is specific to this build. So that is the secrets. So I think I have covered all the things that got built in the push button install. So now let's talk about the initial admin credentials. Azure Domain Services is very unique in that you don't create the actual domain join or admin credentials. What you have to do is create this user within the interest ID, like we just showed you before, Active Directory groups, users, and we script this. We create it in the Terraform. We create that in Terraform, and then we also script the group. So we have to create this special group called, AAD admins, DC administrators. Once you're in that group, you're now an admin that we can use to log in. And all right, so this is kind of cool, but again, it takes up to 15 to 30 minutes for its synchronization. So when you look at the join script, you'll notice that it's looping and it's trying and it's trying and it's trying, and it tries for an hour. And that seemed to fit the bill. It's probably not something you would do normally because you're probably going to create your AD instance and populate it with some other asynchronous process. And you're not going to worry about, I got to have that user right now. But we do handle it in a script here. Alright, so when the Windows instance boots, it joins Active Directory and it creates 4 groups and 4 users. So here's the list: mCloud users, India, US, Linux admins. And so what you'll notice is just this GID number and UID number. And what they're for is there's a RFC that talks about how you do POSIX compliance. It's from the 90s. It's ancient, but Unix is expecting to use the same identity provider. It's expecting for the users that you want to access on Linux to have these 2 attributes set on every user. And if they're not, TripleSD is not going to show it. Now, there are some modes in TripleSD where you can say generate a unique ID, but it makes everything so fragile. Like if a new user gets created and needs the same UID, you can't set it. UID, the SID numbers can actually drift over time, or if you have to redeploy in a new environment, all your SIDs are going to be different. So the right way to do it is to set these numbers in the Active Directory when you log into it. And we have it scripted in the join script for the Windows AD join, but you can also do it in the console, and we'll show you that when we log in. And so that's why you need GID number and UID number. So let's log into the Windows instance. Okay, let's walk through logging into the Windows instance with the AD admin credentials that we created via the synchronization method. So what I'm going to do is click on the instance, and I'm going to say connect via Bastion. And I'm going to go through, and this is the user ID. I got it from the secrets. And so, like I said, here's the secret value. And here's the password. Let me copy that, paste that in, do a show just to make sure I got that right. Yeah, that looks right. And I'm going to hit connect. And you'll see the server manager comes up. By default, that's what it does for all admins. When you're a domain admin, when you're joined, you're also joined to that machine as a local admin, so we're a local admin on this box. And so what we want to do is we want to go to, when we install the boot script, it's going to install all these plugin tools for the administrative tools. So it installs all this Active Directory stuff, the DNS, but we're just going to focus on this one right here. Active Directories, users, and groups. We click on that, and this is going to give you a view of the domain users and groups. And so what we have here is, this is the directory that the domain services builds for you correctly. You've got users and computers. Users here, these are the users that are synced over from your Azure default tenant inside the Azure User Manager. So these are the ones that get synced. We looked at them before. We look at the ones that were in there. They're actually synced over. Then I created a new OU. By default, you can't do anything in these. The domain services instance locks all these AADC go use, so you can't do anything. So it looks like you can't create users. But what you can do is you can create your own OU and then create users in that. So we create our own OU. This is in the script. We have the users. You click on that and you're going to get the 4 users and groups. Now, what you want to do inside Active Directory to see those attributes, that GID number, UID attribute, is you want to go to View, Advanced Features, and you'll get a lot more stuff. So let's go back to the users and groups. And so let's look at Linux admins. Now, here's your Linux admins. You got the members, but most importantly, on the attribute editor, if you scroll down, there's a GID number attribute. And that's from the table that we set it in the script. Every group that you want to access on the Linux side has to have a GID number. Same way, if you look at users and go over here, and then we go to attribute editor, and you should have GID number needs to be set. So 1001, that's mcloud users, and then you need to go to the N, and you're going to have UID number, which is the second most important ones. Don't know why I can't seem to find them. Here it is, UID number. So that's 1003 or 10,003. I usually start my GID UID numbers at above 10,000 because the lower ones tend to be used for system accounts on Linux. You can certainly make a many number you want, but I just try to avoid local account problems or conflicts from the Active Directory accounts, because they're usually different banks. And so from here, I could go and I could do, I could create a new, user or group. So I can basically administrate this like any other Active Directory. Now that I've got into it, I've created my custom OU. I think they refer to these as domain local users and groups. They really encourage you to use the synced users and groups, but I didn't see any way for me to do the GID number, UID number, at least not out of the box. I saw something where you could customize the mappings, and it doesn't seem like that they really thought through that case for the old school Linux POSIX compliance. But maybe I'm wrong. Like all so many cloud things is you just haven't seen it yet. But I didn't see an easy way of doing that here. Okay, so that's it for the Windows server. You'll notice we used the Bastion, so I'm in the browser. So I'm going to do the same thing for the Linux server. So I'm going to click on here, and I'm going to go back to my resource group, and I'm going to go look at the Linux one. So I'm going to click on Linux, and I'm going to say connect via Bastion. And now I need to go get those credentials. So I'll go back to secrets. Let's log in as Raj Patel. And I'm going to go like that. Show secret value. I just need to put on Linux R Patel. And then I need to grab the credentials from here. click on that and let's hit connect. Okay, so the first time it didn't work because I didn't copy and paste it right. It's actually fairly tricky to copy it. I often not copy the last ID. So if it doesn't work, just make sure you've copied it exactly right. That's sort of the pain of these generated passwords is they're kind of cumbersome to deal with. It really doesn't display the secrets very well. We're on the Linux, so we've got that. So let's do ID. Now ID is going to tell me my ID. So 1000 and 10,003, just like we looked before, and then mcloud users. So I can also do get ent group mcloud users, and it'll give you the list. And then I can do a Kumar IDE Davis IDJS John Smith. And you see all those values we set are now presented in the presented in Linux correctly. So that'll be your UID and GID numbers. Also, there's this group called getEnt group Linux admins. And you can see, who am I? I am R Patel. So I should be able to do sudo bash. And there you go. I am now, who am I? I am running as root. Now I wanted to go one thing here. I wanted to look at my SSD configuration. And let's nano SSD config. We're using LDAP mode, which is what's preferred. The other examples we're using AD mode. And the one thing that's a little funky here is they really want you to use LDAP S because they don't want any credentials flying across the network in plain text. But to do that, you have to register a certificate and go through all that, and that's probably not great for this for a demo like this, trying to do it end to end. So what I did is I used this super secret option that you're never supposed to use, which is LDAP off disabled TLS never used in production. This allows you to use a non SSH or non-secure logins. So you don't want to do it, but just for this example, that's what we did. You're going to want to do a certificate. There's videos on that, and it's just rather tedious to do, but that's what you're going to want to do in production, is to get a LDAP-S certificate, get that deployed, and then you just turn that off, and then there's a line in here where you have to give it a certificate if it's not a public CA, but if it's in a public CA, it should work fine. So that's it for the Linux version. You can log in with SSH with any of these guys. So if I do an exit and I do SSH R Patel at localhost, it's going to prompt me. So we've configured SSH to do password authentication. A lot of times the cloud provider turns that off by default because they want you to do SSH. But this is just to show you how, if you wanted to turn that off. I wouldn't do it on the public internet, but in the case of a private network, it's often the case that people have Linux login servers for doing various tasks, whether it's running code, development work, or admin tasks. So that is it for the Linux example. I will close it here. And okay, and now the only thing left to do is to be a good steward of your cloud account and turn off or destroy everything that we've built. This is particularly important with these domain services things because they're very expensive, or relatively expensive. I mean, you seem more expensive, but if you just the generic one or the simplest one is going to run you several $100s a month. So I destroy mine like every day. In fact, they called me at one point and said, "What are you doing?" Because I did this exercise over and over again. So we will go ahead and do that, and then we will talk about the Azure specific things in this build. So let me do destroy. Let it get going. Alright, so what is the Azure specific issues? The first thing is that whole user integration thing that I showed you, where you don't create the admin user, you have to create a cloud user, a Azure Active Directory user, whatever they're calling it is, a cloud user, and then it synchronizes, and then you've got this whole thing where you have to put it in a special group to become a domain admins. That is very unique to it. I guess in the grand scheme of things, it's pretty cool how they're trying to bridge a modern identity provider with a legacy identity provider, which is Active Directory. But it made scripting a little bit more difficult to get it all working with one shot. Key Vault has the uniqueness requirement. You'll see that suffix that I put on there that has to be unique for all Azure tenants, which is unique to Azure. The subnetting, you gotta have your own. You gotta have your Active Directory in its own subnet. Um, the AWS is a little more flexible. GCP it puts it in a totally different VPC, which we'll talk about. And the other thing is those and when you actually go in and log onto the Windows server, you'll see all these OU, everything in the directories, that you can't do anything. AWS, you pretty much have free reign, but what they've done with Azure is they've locked down, presumably to try to protect you from doing stupid things like deleting the admin password, which is what you can do in AWS. So if you want to have what they call domain local users, which you pretty much need for POSIX compliance, you got to create your own U at the root level, and then you can put everything in there. The other thing that was a little bit interesting was the PowerShell can't be specified in the custom data script. It won't take PowerShell. I think it does just KMD or BAT files. So we had to spin up an Azure VM extension that would run the code. You'll see that it has some interesting features in that particular code block where it's trying multiple times, and since if you rerun your Terraform, it'll rerun it again. So there's a block at the top that says if I'm already joined, just exit. So it works a little bit differently with PowerShell than the other environments. Other ones you just give a PowerShell boot script with a user data or a startup script, and it can run PowerShell. So that's all for the stuff that's unique to Azure, and you need to wait for the build to finish, and then we're good to go.